The autumn sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dallas, Texas, as Temperance Caldwell clutched the tattered edges of her once fine dress, the last remnant of her former life. Blood still crusted beneath her fingernails from digging her husband's shallow grave after outlaws left him riddled with bullets, and her with nothing but the clothes on her back. It was 1878, and in the merciless frontier, a woman alone might as well be dead, but Temperance had survived worse than death already. The stagecoach that had carried her the final miles into town departed in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone before the weathered signpost. Her stomach growled painfully. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Pride had kept her from begging during the journey, but pride wouldn't fill her belly or provide shelter as night approached. Dallas was growing rapidly since the railroad's arrival 5 years prior, but it still held the rawness of a frontier town. Saloons outnumbered churches, and the steady piano music drifting from their swinging doors promised warmth and life that contrasted sharply with Temperance's current state of desolation. She walked slowly down the street, aware of the curious stares her disheveled appearance attracted. Her chestnut hair, once her crowning glory, hung in tangled waves around her face. The blue dress that had been suitable for traveling was now stained with dirt and memories too painful to acknowledge. "You look like you could use some help, madam," came a deep voice from behind her. Temperance turned, defensive instincts flaring. The man who'd spoken sat atop a dappled gray horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "I don't need charity," she replied, though everything about her contradicted this statement. "Wasn't offering any." The stranger stepped into a patch of sunlight, revealing features that made Temperance catch her breath despite herself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking, with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. "Ethan Adler," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly. "I own the Double-A ranch outside of town, looking for help with the household since my housekeeper took ill." Temperance regarded him warily. She'd heard stories of women lured into situations far worse than starvation by promises of employment. "What kind of help?" she asked, unable to mask the suspicion in her voice. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "The cooking and cleaning kind, madam, nothing improper. I've got a reputation to maintain in these parts." Something in his direct gaze convinced her he was telling the truth. Or perhaps it was simply desperation. "I'm Temperance Caldwell," she said, offering her name like it was the only valuable thing she possessed, which in many ways it was. Ethan nodded as though accepting something precious. "You'll have your own quarters. Pays fair. And you look like you could use a hot meal right about now." Temperance hesitated, pride warring with necessity. "I'm alone in the world, Mr. Adler. My husband was killed by bandits on our way west." She lifted her chin. "This dress and hope for better days are all I have left." Ethan studied her for a long moment, taking in her threadbare dress, the determined set of her jaw, and the fire that still burned in her eyes despite everything. "That's plenty for me," he said quietly. "Anyone who still has hope after what you've been through is worth taking a chance on." The words were simple, but they struck Temperance with unexpected force. Not pity, but respect. She found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to accept. "I should warn you, I've never been a housekeeper before. My husband and I were headed to California to start a new life. Before that, I taught school in Boston." "We don't stand on ceremony at the Double-A," Ethan replied, reaching for his horse's reins. "Can you cook?" "Well enough not to poison anyone." That earned her another smile, broader this time. "That's all I ask." He led his horse closer. "We can ride double back to the ranch, unless you'd prefer to wait while I fetch the wagon." The thought of remaining in town, subject to more curious stares and with night approaching, made the decision easy. "I can ride." Ethan helped her mount, his hands strong and steady as he lifted her onto the horse's back. She settled her skirts as best she could, conscious of maintaining some semblance of propriety despite the circumstances. When he swung up behind her, Temperance stiffened momentarily at the unfamiliar proximity. "Hold on," he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. The ride out of Dallas took them through countryside, gradually transforming from scrubby prairie to more fertile rangeland. Despite her exhaustion, Temperance couldn't help noticing the beauty of the landscape as the setting sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. "How far is your ranch?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "About 8 miles. We should reach it before full dark." True to his word, they crested a gentle rise just as dusk was settling across the land to reveal a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. A 2-story house of whitewashed wood stood at the center, flanked by a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Lantern light glowed warmly from several windows. "It's larger than I expected," Temperance said. "Started with just the cabin," Ethan replied, nodding toward a smaller structure set apart from the main house. "Built the rest over the last 10 years. Texas has been good to me." They rode into a yard where a young man hurried forward to take the horse's reins. Ethan dismounted first, then reached up to help Temperance down. Her legs trembled slightly after the long ride, and his hands lingered at her waist just long enough to ensure she was steady. "This is Mrs. Caldwell," he told the young stable hand. "She'll be taking over for Mrs. Harmon while she recovers." The boy nodded respectfully. "Evening, madam." Ethan led her toward the house, explaining as they walked. "Got 4 ranch hands who bunk in the bunkhouse. They take their meals in the main house, breakfast and dinner. Miguel's wife, Rosa, helps with laundry twice a week, but otherwise, the household will be your domain." The house was surprisingly well appointed inside, with solid furniture and touches of refinement that spoke of care and attention to detail. Temperance found herself wondering about the woman who might have selected the blue patterned china displayed in a cabinet in the dining room. Reading her thoughts, Ethan said, "My mother chose most of the furnishings before she passed. She always believed in making a proper home, even on the frontier." "She had good taste," Temperance offered, following him through to a spacious kitchen dominated by a large iron stove and a scrubbed wooden table. "Your quarters are through there." Ethan indicated a door off the kitchen. "It's not fancy, but it's private. There's a washroom off the back porch." He paused, seeming to really look at her for the first time since they'd arrived. "You must be exhausted. Let's get you something to eat and then you can rest. Everything else can wait until morning." Relief washed over Temperance. The thought of food and a bed, any bed, was overwhelming after days of uncertainty. "Thank you," she managed, the simple words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. Ethan moved efficiently around the kitchen, slicing bread and cold meat, setting out preserves and a pitcher of milk. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it'll tide you over until morning." It was the finest meal Temperance could remember. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while Ethan sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee. "Your husband," he said finally. "When did it happen?" Temperance set down her fork. 4 days ago, near the Red River." "Did you report it to the authorities?" She shook her head. "There wasn't time. Or opportunity. I buried him myself and caught the next stage coach south. The men who killed him." She trailed off, the memory still too raw. "Took everything," Ethan guessed. "Everything but what I'm wearing." Temperance touched the fabric of her dress. "And my wedding ring, which I managed to hide." She twisted the simple gold band that remained on her finger. Ethan's eyes darkened with something that might have been anger, but his voice remained steady. "The law is still catching up with the territory. But rangers have been making progress against the worst gangs. It won't bring Thomas back," Temperance said softly. Then, with effort, she straightened her shoulders. "But I'm alive, and I intend to stay that way." "Good," Ethan said simply. He rose from the table. "Get some rest, Mrs. Caldwell. Morning comes early on a ranch." Left alone, Temperance explored her small quarters. A narrow bed with a surprisingly comfortable-looking mattress occupied one wall, with a chest of drawers and small washstand providing the only other furnishings. A window overlooked the yard, and heavy curtains promised privacy. She washed as best she could with the basin and pitcher of water provided, then slipped beneath the clean sheets of the bed. Despite her physical and emotional exhaustion, sleep eluded her for a time as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, wondering what twist of fate had brought her to this place. Thomas had been so certain about their future in California. An accountant by training, he'd secured a position with a growing bank in San Francisco. They would have a comfortable home, perhaps children in time. Now those dreams were buried in a shallow grave hundreds of miles away, and Temperance was left to forge a new path alone. Except she wasn't entirely alone. The thought of Ethan Adler's steady presence was strangely comforting as she finally drifted into exhausted slumber. Dawn broke with the crowing of a rooster and the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Temperance woke disoriented before memory flooded back. She dressed quickly in her one dress, splashed water on her face and made her way to the kitchen, determined to prove her worth from the start. To her surprise, Ethan was already there, stoking the fire in the stove. "Good morning," he said, straightening as she entered. "Coffee's nearly ready. Thought you might need a slower start after yesterday." "I'm fine," Temperance insisted, though her body ached from the unaccustomed horseback ride. "Please let me take over. It's why I'm here." He relinquished his place by the stove with a slight smile. "Ranch hands will be in for breakfast in about an hour. They're simple men with simple tastes: biscuits, eggs, meat. Whatever you can manage." "I can manage," Temperance assured him, already rolling up her sleeves. "Is there an apron I might use?" Ethan pointed to a hook by the pantry door. "Mrs. Harmon's. She won't mind." As he turned to leave, Temperance called after him. "Mr. Adler, thank you again for the opportunity." He paused in the doorway. "Everyone deserves a second chance at life, Mrs. Caldwell." Something in his expression suggested he was speaking from experience. Left alone, Temperance took a deep breath and surveyed the kitchen that would now be her domain. It was well stocked and organized, speaking to Mrs. Harmon's efficiency. The stove was already radiating heat, and a quick exploration of the pantry revealed flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples. A trip to the springhouse yielded eggs, milk, and butter. By the time the ranch hands filed in, stamping boots and washing up at the basin by the door, Temperance had produced a respectable breakfast of biscuits, scrambled eggs, and sliced ham. She served them with as much dignity as she could muster, aware of their curious glances. "This is Mrs. Caldwell," Ethan introduced her as he took his seat at the head of the table. "She'll be taking care of the house while Mrs. Harmon recovers." There were nods and murmured greetings. The men were a mixed lot. Miguel, who she'd heard mentioned the night before, was clearly of Mexican heritage. A weathered older man introduced as Hank, and two younger men called Jim and Patrick, who might have been brothers from their similar features. They ate with the focused attention of men who worked hard and valued their meals. Temperance refilled coffee cups and brought more biscuits when the first batch disappeared. Best biscuits since my mama's, Jim declared, reaching for another. Don't let Mrs. Harmon hear you say that, Hank warned, but the twinkle in his eye suggested he agreed. Ethan caught her eye across the table and gave an approving nod that warmed Temperance more than it should have. The men departed soon after, leaving her with a kitchen to clean and the day's tasks ahead. She worked steadily, finding a rhythm to the chores that was oddly satisfying after the chaos of recent days. Mid-morning, Ethan returned to the house. "I'm heading into town for supplies," he announced. "Anything you need?" Temperance hesitated, embarrassed. "I have nothing to my name, Mr. Adler." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Of course, you'll need clothes, personal items." He reached into his pocket and pulled out several bills. "Consider it an advance on your wages." She accepted the money reluctantly. "I'll repay every cent." "I know you will." His confidence in her was unexpected and strangely affecting. "Make a list of what you need for the kitchen, too, and call me Ethan. Mr. Adler makes me feel like my father." After he'd gone, Temperance explored the house more thoroughly, taking inventory of what needed attention. The place was reasonably tidy but showed signs of having lacked a woman's touch for some time. She dusted and swept, aired bedding, and planned meals for the coming days. By late afternoon, she heard the wagon returning. Ethan carried in several packages wrapped in brown paper. The general store had ready-made dresses that should fit you with minor alterations, he explained, setting the packages on the table. "And Mrs. Peterson at the millinery sent these." Inside the smaller package were undergarments and personal items that made Temperance blush to think of Ethan purchasing them, though she desperately needed them. "Mrs. Peterson selected them," he assured her, correctly reading her discomfort. "I just paid the bill." "Thank you," she said, gathering the packages. "I'll try not to impose on your generosity for long." "It's not generosity, it's necessity," Ethan corrected. "Can't have my housekeeper in rags, can I? Bad for my reputation." The teasing glint in his eye made Temperance smile despite herself. She retreated to her room to examine the purchases more carefully. There were 2 serviceable day dresses in brown and blue calico, a Sunday dress of deeper blue that was almost pretty, stockings, undergarments, and even a nightgown. A smaller package revealed hairpins, a comb, and a bar of lavender-scented soap that made Temperance's eyes sting with unexpected tears. Such simple comforts, things she'd taken for granted before. Now they seemed like extravagant luxuries. She washed her hair that evening, using precious hot water and the new soap, and went to bed feeling more human than she had in days. The next week passed in a blur of work and adjustment. Temperance settled into the rhythm of ranch life, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, spending mornings on household tasks, afternoons on baking and preparing dinner, and evenings mending or reading one of the surprisingly numerous books from Ethan's small library. She saw little of the ranch owner during daylight hours. He left with the men after breakfast and returned for dinner, often covered in dust or mud from whatever work had occupied his day. But the evenings sometimes found them sharing the parlor, Temperance with her mending, Ethan with account books or correspondence. These quiet times gave her glimpses of the man behind the cowboy exterior. He was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from territorial politics to literature. She learned he'd come to Texas as a young man of 20, after serving briefly in the Union Army during the final year of the Civil War. He'd worked as a cowhand, saved his money, and eventually bought his first parcel of land. "It wasn't much," he told her one evening. "Just the cabin and 50 acres, but it was mine." "You've built something impressive," Temperance acknowledged. Ethan shrugged. "Been lucky with the weather and cattle prices. and I had good men willing to throw in with me. It's more than luck, she observed. It's vision and hard work. He looked pleased at the compliment, though he tried to hide it. What about you? How does a Boston schoolteacher end up heading for California? Temperance set aside her mending. Thomas, my husband, felt there were better opportunities out west. Boston is established, set in its ways. California is still being shaped. And what did you think of the plan? The question caught her off guard. No one, not even Thomas, had ever asked what she thought about uprooting her life. I was willing, she said finally. Teaching positions for women are limited and mostly for unmarried ladies. Once I wed Thomas, that path was closed to me anyway. Do you miss teaching? Sometimes. I enjoyed helping children discover the world through books. Temperance smiled at a memory. There was a boy, Samuel, who struggled terribly with reading. When he finally read a full page aloud without mistake, his smile was like the sun coming out. Ethan watched her face as she spoke, his expression thoughtful. There's no school near here. Nearest is in Dallas. Lots of children on surrounding ranches going without proper education. That's a shame, Temperance said sincerely. Maybe someday that could change, Ethan remarked, then returned to his accounts, leaving Temperance to wonder at his meaning. On Sunday, Temperance put on the blue dress that was slightly finer than her everyday wear and prepared to attend church in Dallas. She was surprised when Ethan appeared in a clean shirt and his best trousers. "You're coming to services?" she asked. "I try to make it most Sundays," he replied. "Sets a good example for the men. Besides, the sermon's a small price to pay for the pie social after." She laughed, the sound surprising both of them. It was the first time she'd laughed since Thomas's death, and the realization sobered her quickly. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. "It's all right to find joy again, Temperance," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. "Living doesn't dishonor your husband's memory." Her throat tight with emotion, she could only nod. The church service introduced her to the wider community. Women eyed her curiously as she sat beside Ethan in the Adler family pew. After the service, several approached to welcome her to the area, though Temperance noticed the colder reception from some of the unmarried ladies and widows when they realized her connection to Ethan. "Don't mind them," a friendly woman about Temperance's age advised her during the social. "They've been setting their caps for Ethan Adler for years." "Oh, but I'm just his housekeeper," Temperance clarified quickly. The woman, who had introduced herself as Sarah Jenkins, raised an eyebrow skeptically. "If you say so, dear. Anyway, we're glad to see a new face. Dallas is growing, but we still welcome newcomers, especially educated women. I'm the school teacher, by the way." "I taught school in Boston," Temperance found herself saying. Sarah's face lit up. "Did you really? Oh, we must talk more. I'm always looking for new teaching methods." By the time they left the social, Temperance had made a tentative friend and promised to visit the schoolhouse the following Saturday. She felt lighter than she had in weeks, despite the occasional pang of guilt when she caught herself enjoying the day. "You made quite an impression," Ethan commented as they rode back to the ranch. "Sarah seems lovely," Temperance replied. "It will be nice to have a friend. She's a good woman. Her husband died at Vicksburg. She came west to start fresh like many others." The knowledge that Sarah had also lost a spouse comforted Temperance somehow. If the schoolteacher could build a new life from the ashes of tragedy, perhaps she could too. The following weeks settled into a comfortable routine. Temperance grew more confident in her role at the ranch, adding touches that made the house feel more like a home. Fresh flowers on the table, curtains washed and rehung, floors polished to a shine. The men noticed and appreciated the changes, especially the improvements to their meals as Temperance's cooking skills developed. Her friendship with Sarah blossomed through letters and occasional visits. The school teacher introduced her to other women in the community, widening her circle beyond the ranch. Ethan noticed these changes in her with apparent approval. "You're putting down roots," he observed one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in vivid hues. "Am I?" Temperance mused. "I hadn't thought of it that way. The house feels different, better." He gestured with his coffee cup. "You've made it a home again." The compliment warmed her. "I'm glad. You've been very generous to me, Ethan. I want to repay that in whatever ways I can." His eyes met hers, something unreadable in their gray depths. "Having you here is repayment enough." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Temperance wasn't ready to name. She looked away first, focusing on the darkening horizon. "Will you still go to California?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. "When you've saved enough money," the question startled her. She hadn't thought about California in weeks. The dream had died with Thomas, she realized. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "It doesn't feel like my destination anymore." Ethan nodded as though her answer satisfied him. "No need to decide tonight. You have a place here as long as you want it." The simple assurance meant more to Temperance than he could know. For the first time since the attack, she felt she might truly have a future again. The next day brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Temperance was hanging laundry in the yard when a wagon approached, driven by an elderly woman with a stern countenance. Beside her sat a younger woman wrapped in a shawl despite the warm weather. "That's Mrs. Harmon," Miguel informed Temperance as he paused in his work nearby. "Looks like she's brought her niece." Temperance felt a sudden chill. If Mrs. Harmon was recovered, her own position at the ranch might be in jeopardy. Ethan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he went to greet the visitors. Temperance couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Mrs. Harmon gesturing emphatically while the younger woman kept her eyes downcast. After several minutes, Ethan helped them back into their wagon and they departed. He stood watching them go for a long moment before turning toward the house, his expression troubled. Temperance hurried to finish hanging the laundry and returned to the kitchen, where she found Ethan waiting. "That was Mrs. Harmon," he said unnecessarily. "She won't be returning to work here." Relief flooded Temperance before she could check the reaction. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is she still unwell?" "No, she's recovered. But her niece, Mary, is in a delicate situation. Unmarried and—" He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Harmon will be caring for her until the child comes." "I see," Temperance said, understanding the gravity of the young woman's position in such a judgmental society. "Mrs. Harmon came to inform me she's accepted a position in Fort Worth, where no one knows Mary. They'll say she's a young widow." Ethan met Temperance's eyes directly. "Which means your position here is secure if you want it." "I do," she said, perhaps too quickly. "That is, I'm happy here." Something in Ethan's face softened. "Good, that's good." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the other hands for the midday meal, but Temperance carried the memory of Ethan's expression with her for the rest of the day. That night, she wrote a long, overdue letter to her parents in Boston, informing them of Thomas's death and her new situation. She had delayed writing, partly from grief and partly from shame at her reduced circumstances. But something about the permanence of her position at the ranch gave her the courage to finally put pen to paper. She was honest about the tragedy, but reassuring about her current circumstances, describing the ranch and the kindness of its owner without dwelling on details that might alarm them. She didn't expect them to understand her new life. They had never approved of her marriage to Thomas or the move west, but she owed them the truth. Summer yielded to autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and changing routines at the ranch. The men worked longer hours preparing for winter, and Temperance found herself busier than ever with preserving fruits and vegetables, making soap, and ensuring the house was ready for the colder months ahead. She had been at the double for nearly 3 months when the first significant rain of the season arrived, a cold downpour that kept everyone indoors for 2 days. By the third morning, the rain had subsided to a drizzle, but the normally dry creek that ran near the ranch had swollen to a rushing torrent. "We need to check the south pasture fence," Ethan told the men at breakfast. "That creek will have taken out posts if it rose as high as I think it did." "Want me to come along?" Hank offered. "Extra hands make quicker work." Ethan nodded gratefully. "Could use you. Miguel, you and the boys stay here and finish repairing the barn roof. Last thing we need is leaks with winter coming." They departed after breakfast, Ethan promising to return by dinner. Temperance spent the morning catching up on indoor tasks that had been neglected during the busy harvest season. She was kneading bread dough when Miguel appeared at the kitchen door, his expression grave. "Senora Caldwell, there is trouble. One of the horses has returned without its rider." Temperance's hands stilled in the dough. "Ethan's horse?" Miguel nodded, his dark eyes worried. And there is blood on the saddle." Fear clutched at Temperance's heart. "Get the men, we need to find him." "Already preparing, Senora, but the creek is dangerous and the rain starts again." Miguel glanced toward the window, where clouds were indeed gathering again. "I'm coming with you," Temperance decided, already reaching to untie her apron. "It is not safe. I was raised near the coast in Massachusetts," she interrupted. "I know how to handle myself near water, and if Ethan is injured, you might need my help." Miguel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but you must promise to be careful. The patron would have my hide if anything happened to you." Temperance changed quickly into her sturdiest clothes and boots, grateful that Ethan had insisted on providing her with proper footwear soon after her arrival. By the time she emerged, the men had saddled horses and gathered rope and medical supplies. "We follow the creek downstream," Miguel decided, if he was crossing when it rose suddenly. He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the danger. The ride to the south pasture was tense and silent. Rain began to fall again as they neared the creek, which had become a raging brown river, carrying debris and uprooted trees in its churning current. "There," Jim pointed suddenly, "on the far bank." Squinting through the rain, Temperance made out 2 figures huddled beneath a rocky overhang. One was clearly Ethan, his familiar hat visible even at a distance. The other was Hank, and even from where they sat, it was obvious the older man was injured. "They cannot cross back," Miguel said grimly. "The water is too swift." "And it's rising," Patrick added, "if it reaches that overhang before the rain stops." Temperance scanned the creek banks desperately. "Is there a narrower point? Somewhere we could stretch a rope across?" Jim shook his head. "Not for half a mile in either direction. And we'd lose that much time backtracking." "Then we cross here," Temperance decided. "At least get a rope to them so they can secure themselves if the water rises further." "It's too dangerous," Miguel protested. "We have to try." Temperance dismounted, her eyes still fixed on the figures across the creek. "If we work together, we can form a human chain." The men exchanged dubious glances, but the urgency of the situation overrode their concerns. They dismounted and secured the horses, then gathered the longest ropes they had brought. "I'll go first," Jim volunteered. "I'm the strongest swimmer." "I'll follow," Temperance said firmly. Then Miguel. "Patrick stays here to anchor the rope and care for the horses." Miguel looked like he wanted to argue but recognized the logic in her plan. Jim tied one end of the rope securely around his waist, with the other end around Temperance's. A second rope connected her to Miguel, and a third from Miguel to Patrick, who would remain on solid ground. "Ready?" Jim asked, eyeing the churning water with trepidation despite his earlier confidence. Temperance nodded, heart hammering in her chest. "Ready." They entered the creek at a point slightly upstream from Ethan and Hank's position, allowing for the current to carry them down to the overhang. The water was shockingly cold, the current stronger than it had appeared from the bank. Temperance gasped as it tugged at her legs, threatening to sweep her off her feet. "Lean into it," Jim called over his shoulder, "and keep moving." She followed his advice, angling her body against the current and taking deliberate steps on the creek bed, which was mercifully rocky rather than muddy. The water rose quickly to her waist, then her chest as they moved toward the deepest part of the channel. For a terrifying moment, her feet lost contact with the bottom and she flailed, panic rising in her throat. Then Jim's strong hand grasped her arm, steadying her until she found her footing again. "Almost there," he encouraged. Across the creek, Ethan had spotted their rescue attempt. He stood at the edge of the overhang, waving and shouting words that were lost in the roar of the water. The crossing seemed to take hours, though in reality it was probably less than 10 minutes. By the time they reached the far bank, Temperance was exhausted and chilled to the bone, but triumphant. Ethan helped pull her up the slippery bank, his hands strong and sure. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, but his eyes betrayed relief rather than anger. "That you needed help," she replied simply, turning to assist Jim with the rope. Hank was propped against the rock wall, his leg bound with a makeshift splint fashioned from tree branches. "Broke it when the horse spooked at a snake," he explained through gritted teeth. "Ethan got me out of the water, but we couldn't get back across." Jim surveyed the situation quickly. "We need to make a travois to move him." "No time," Ethan said, nodding toward the rising water. "Creek's coming up too fast. We need to cross now while we still can." They fashioned a harness from the ropes, securing Hank between Ethan and Jim for the crossing. Temperance and Miguel would follow, maintaining tension on the guideline that now stretched across the creek. The return journey was even more harrowing than the first crossing. The water had risen noticeably, and the rain continued to fall in sheets. Halfway across, a floating branch struck Temperance's side, knocking her sideways into the current. She went under, disoriented and frightened, before the rope around her waist snapped taut, preventing her from being swept away. Strong hands grasped her arms, pulling her to the surface. She emerged gasping to find Ethan had abandoned his position and come back for her. "I've got you," he shouted over the roar of the water. "Hold on to me." Together they rejoined the others and struggled the rest of the way across. By the time they reached the bank, Temperance was barely able to stand, her strength sapped by cold and exertion. Ethan lifted her onto his horse without ceremony, then mounted behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, his body shielding hers from the worst of the rain as they rode back to the ranch. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said against her ear. Temperance leaned back against his solid warmth, too exhausted to maintain the proper distance between them. "Perhaps both." His chest rumbled with what might have been a chuckle. "Perhaps both," he agreed. By the time they reached the ranch, Temperance was shivering uncontrollably. Ethan carried her into the house despite her weak protests that she could walk. "Get Hank settled in the bunkhouse," he instructed the men. "I'll see to Mrs. Caldwell." He set her down carefully in the kitchen. "You need dry clothes and warmth. Can you manage, or shall I fetch Rosa?" "I can manage," Temperance assured him through chattering teeth. Ethan nodded, though he looked reluctant to leave her. "I'll build up the fires and be back to check on you shortly." In her room, Temperance struggled out of her sodden clothing, her fingers clumsy with cold. She dried herself as best she could and put on her warmest nightgown and the woolen shawl Sarah had given her. Her hair hung in a damp rope down her back. She lacked the energy to do more than towel it roughly when she emerged. Ethan had indeed built the kitchen fire to blazing intensity. He had changed as well, into dry clothes that still clung to his damp skin in places. He was brewing tea, his movements efficient despite what must have been his own discomfort. "Sit by the fire," he instructed. "You need to get warm." Temperance obeyed, too drained to argue. Ethan handed her a steaming cup of tea sweetened with honey, then surprised her by wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured, cradling the warm cup in her still cold hands. Ethan pulled a chair close to hers. "I should be thanking you. What you did today." He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said firmly, "not anyone. You risked your life for Hank, for me." Temperance met his gaze, suddenly aware of how close he sat. How intimate this moment felt with both of them in their night clothes, huddled by the fire while rain lashed the windows. "I couldn't bear the thought of losing you," she admitted softly, the words slipping out before she could reconsider them. Ethan went very still. "Temperance," he began, then stopped, struggling visibly with something he wanted to say. She waited, heart pounding. "I've tried to keep a proper distance," he finally continued. "You're still grieving your husband and I'm your employer, but today when I saw you in that creek," his voice roughened, "I realized some things can't be ignored forever." "What things?" Temperance whispered. Instead of answering with words, Ethan leaned forward and gently, hesitantly, pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it sent warmth flooding through Temperance's body in a way the fire and tea had failed to do. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Have been since the day you stood in the street in Dallas with nothing but a dress and your pride." Temperance's breath caught. Part of her wanted to retreat from this declaration, to hide behind propriety and the memory of Thomas. But a stronger part recognized the truth that had been growing in her own heart for weeks. "I feel something too," she admitted, "but I'm afraid of what it means to open my heart again, of what people will say." "People will talk regardless," Ethan said, taking her hands in his. "And fear is natural after what you've been through. I'm not asking for promises, just permission to court you properly when you're ready." The request was so formal, so respectful, that Temperance felt tears spring to her eyes. This was a man who understood honor and patience. "I think I'd like that," she said softly, "when the time is right." Ethan's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then I'll wait, however long it takes." The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Temperance rose early despite her aching muscles, determined to maintain her routines and responsibilities. She found Ethan in the kitchen before the others, stoking the fire as he often did. Their eyes met across the room, a moment of silent acknowledgement passing between them before they both turned to their tasks. The day passed in a blur of activity. Hank's broken leg required proper setting by the doctor, who was summoned from Dallas. The creek had damaged fencing that needed repair, and the storm had blown shingles from the barn roof. Everyone worked from dawn to dusk to address the most urgent matters. Yet through it all, Temperance was aware of Ethan's presence in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be before. She noticed the lines of concentration on his face as he gave instructions to the men, the gentleness in his hands as he helped the doctor with Hank, the way his eyes sought hers across a room. That evening, after the others had retired, they sat together on the porch despite the chill in the air. The storm had left the sky exceptionally clear, with stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet blackness. "My father taught me the constellations," Ethan said, pointing upward. "Said a man could never be truly lost if he could read the stars. Were you close to him?" Temperance asked, drawn by this glimpse into his past. "Very. He was a good man, strict but fair." Ethan's voice held a note of old grief. "Lost him to pneumonia the winter before I joined the army. And your mother followed him 6 months later. The doctor called it heart failure, but I think it was heartbreak." He glanced at Temperance. "They were devoted to each other for 30 years. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "And rare. Not as rare as you might think out here. Life on the frontier strips away pretense. People show their true nature for better or worse." Ethan shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing hers. "What about your parents? You mentioned they're in Boston." Temperance nodded. "My father is a professor at Harvard. My mother runs their household with military precision. They were disappointed when I chose to marry Thomas instead of continuing to teach." "Would they approve of your life now?" Ethan asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Hardly," Temperance laughed softly. "A housekeeper on a Texas cattle ranch, they would be scandalized." She paused, considering. "But they didn't approve of much I've done since turning 18. I've learned to make peace with that." Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You're a remarkable woman, Temperance Caldwell." The simple touch and sincere words warmed her more than any elaborate declaration could have. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to their relationship. Ethan was true to his word about courting her properly. He brought her wildflowers gathered during his rides around the property. They read together in the evenings, sometimes sharing passages aloud. On Sundays, they attended church together, ignoring the speculative glances their obvious attachment attracted. Yet he never pressed for more than she was ready to give, respecting the boundaries of propriety and her continuing process of grief. As Christmas approached, the ranch preparations took on a festive air. Temperance baked special treats and decorated the house with greenery and red ribbons. The men brought in a pine tree from the hills to the north, setting it up in the parlor where Temperance adorned it with ornaments fashioned from paper, cloth, and pine cones. "My mother would have loved this," Ethan commented, watching her work. "She always made Christmas special, even when times were lean." "What traditions did you have?" Temperance asked, curious about this glimpse into his childhood. "We'd read the Christmas story on Christmas Eve, hang stockings by the fire. And no matter how tight money was, there was always an orange in the toe of that stocking." His smile was tinged with nostalgia. "Simple things, but they mattered. We'll honor those traditions," Temperance decided, "and perhaps start some new ones." The casual "we" slipped out before she realized it, but Ethan's pleased expression told her he'd noticed and welcomed the implication of a shared future. Christmas Eve brought a rare snowfall, light flakes that dusted the landscape like sugar. After the evening meal, the ranch hands gathered in the main house, where Temperance had prepared hot cider and Christmas cookies. Ethan read the nativity story from his mother's Bible, his deep voice adding gravity to the familiar words. Later, when the men had returned to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Ethan presented Temperance with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. "It isn't much," he said, uncharacteristically nervous. Temperance unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small leather-bound book of poetry. Opening the cover, she found an inscription. "To Temperance, who brought hope back into this house. With deepest affection, Ethan." "It's perfect," she whispered, deeply touched by the thoughtful gift. "There's something else," Ethan said. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a slender silver chain with a small pendant, a star, simply wrought but beautiful in its clarity of design. "The star that guides us home," he explained, referencing their conversation about constellations. "May I?" Temperance nodded, turning so he could fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin at her nape, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter chill. When she turned back, Ethan was watching her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "I have something for you too," she said, her voice not quite steady. From beneath the tree, she retrieved a package of similar size to the one he'd given her. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in shades of gray and blue that complemented his eyes. She had worked on it secretly during evenings when he was occupied with ranch accounts, using yarn purchased on her visits to Dallas. "You made this?" Ethan asked, running the soft wool between his fingers. Temperance nodded. "I wanted to give you something personal. Something that would keep you warm when you're out on the range." "I'll treasure it," he said, wrapping it around his neck immediately despite the warmth of the room. "Like I treasure the hands that made it." He caught her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that was both reverent and intimate. Temperance's breath caught at the gesture. "Ethan," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say but feeling the need to speak the emotions welling within her. "I know it's too soon," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. Just know that whenever you are ready, my heart is yours." The simple declaration moved her deeply. She stepped closer, resting her hand against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that my heart is healing faster than I expected. Because of you." Ethan's arms encircled her, drawing her against his solid warmth. When his lips found hers this time, the kiss was deeper, fuller with promise and longing. Temperance responded with a passion that surprised them both, her hands curling into the fabric of his shirt as if to anchor herself against the tide of emotion. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Temperance," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Ethan," she replied, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a few months. Winter gradually yielded to spring, bringing new life to the Texas landscape. Wildflowers carpeted the pastures in brilliant blues and reds, and calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the growing herd. Temperance's relationship with Ethan deepened with the lengthening days. They rode together on Sundays after church, exploring the far reaches of his property. He taught her to shoot a rifle, insisting she needed to be able to protect herself if necessary. She taught him to bake his mother's favorite cookies, working from the carefully preserved recipe she'd found tucked in a kitchen drawer. Their courtship did not go unnoticed in the community. Sarah Jenkins teased Temperance about landing the most eligible bachelor in the county, while some of the other women regarded her with thinly veiled envy or disapproval. "Pay them no mind," Ethan advised when Temperance mentioned the mixed reception she received at church socials. "People will talk until something more interesting comes along." "It's not just that," Temperance admitted as they walked along the creek, which had returned to its normal placid state with the dry season. "I sometimes wonder if I've dishonored Thomas's memory by finding happiness again so quickly." Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Do you think Thomas would have wanted you to mourn forever? To deny yourself a chance at love and family?" Put that way, the answer was clear. "No, he was a practical man. He would have wanted me to survive, to thrive if possible." "Then honor his memory by living fully," Ethan said, squeezing her hand. "That's the greatest tribute you can pay him." His wisdom comforted her, as did the knowledge that he understood and respected her continuing moments of grief. They came less frequently now, but occasionally something would trigger a memory, a particular song, the scent of the cologne Thomas had favored, the sight of a young couple planning their future together. In April, a letter arrived from Temperance's parents. They expressed appropriate condolences for Thomas's death, then inquired pointedly about her plans to return to Boston. Her father had secured a teaching position for her at a respectable girls' school, they wrote, and they expected her to accept it promptly. They still see me as a child who needs direction, Temperance sighed, showing the letter to Ethan as they sat in the garden she'd started behind the house. "What will you tell them?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. She looked around at the life she'd built here, the flourishing garden, the house that had become a home under her care, the man beside her who had come to mean everything. "That I've found my place," she said simply. "Here with you." The joy that bloomed on Ethan's face was worth any disapproval her parents might express. "In that case," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He produced a small velvet box, worn at the edges as though it had been handled often. Opening it revealed a ring, a modest diamond flanked by two smaller sapphires, set in gold that glowed warmly in the spring sunlight. "It was my mother's," Ethan explained, his voice husky with emotion. "My father saved for 3 years to buy it for her." Temperance's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Ethan slid from the bench to kneel before her, taking her hand in his. "Temperance Caldwell, you came to me with nothing but a dress and hope, but you've given me everything I never knew I was missing. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred her vision as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it settled as though it had been made for her. Then he rose and pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. They were married on the first day of summer, beneath an arbor constructed by the ranch hands and decorated with roses from Temperance's garden. Sarah stood as her witness, while Miguel stood for Ethan. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with neighbors and friends from Dallas and surrounding ranches in attendance. Temperance wore a new dress of ivory silk, ordered from a dressmaker in Dallas, with some of the money she'd carefully saved from her wages. Her parents had declined to attend, their disapproval of her decision evident in their terse reply to her news. But as she spoke her vows to Ethan beneath the Texas sky, their absence seemed inconsequential compared to the joy of the moment. "I, Ethan, take you, Temperance, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When she repeated the vows, Temperance felt the rightness of them in her very soul. This was no hasty decision born of convenience or desperation, but a choice made with her whole heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Ethan's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise before God and their community. The cheers and applause that followed were genuine in their approval of the match. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food, music, and dancing in the yard behind the house. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the festivities. "Mrs. Adler," Ethan murmured in her ear as they swayed together to a slow melody played by a fiddler from town. "How does it sound?" "Perfect," Temperance replied, nestling closer in his arms. "Absolutely perfect." Later, when the last guests had departed and the house was quiet, Ethan carried her across the threshold of the bedroom, their bedroom now. The space had been transformed in her absence that day, with fresh linens on the larger bed that had replaced Ethan's bachelor furnishings, wildflowers in a vase on the dresser, and candles casting a soft light over everything. "When did you do all this?" Temperance asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Had some help from Sarah and Rosa," Ethan admitted with a smile. "Wanted everything to be special for you." What followed was a night of tender discovery as they learned each other in the most intimate way. Ethan was gentle and patient, guiding Temperance through moments of uncertainty with reassurance and love. By the time they lay together in the quiet hours before dawn, their bodies entwined and sated, she felt truly his wife in every sense of the word. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, where his heart beat steadily beneath her ear. His arms tightened around her. "And I love you more than I have words to express." The months that followed were the happiest of Temperance's life. She embraced her role as Ethan's wife and partner in all aspects of ranch life. Though they had hired a new housekeeper, a young widow named Clara with a small child, Temperance still took an active role in managing the household and making decisions about the running of the ranch. Ethan consulted her on business matters, valuing her education and perspective. Together, they made improvements to the property, expanding the garden to include vegetables for the ranch's consumption, and planning for a proper orchard the following spring. In the fall, they hosted a harvest festival for neighboring ranches and farms, establishing a tradition that would continue for years to come. Temperance took particular pleasure in seeing the ranch house filled with laughter and community, fulfilling the potential she had sensed in it from the beginning. Winter brought news that filled their hearts with joy and anticipation. Temperance was with child, due to deliver in the late spring. Ethan's reaction to the announcement was everything she could have hoped for: wonder, joy, and fierce protectiveness all mingled in his embrace. "A family of our own," he marveled, his hand resting gently on her still flat abdomen. "I never dared hope for so much happiness." "Nor I," Temperance admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought my chance for children had died with him." Ethan kissed her softly. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. As Temperance's pregnancy progressed, the entire ranch seemed to revolve around her well-being. The men brought her unusual rocks or feathers they found on their rides. Clara made special teas to ease her occasional morning sickness. And Ethan insisted on reading to her each evening, claiming it was good for the baby to hear stories early. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and the birth of new calves. Temperance's body had rounded beautifully, her child active and strong beneath her heart. She often caught Ethan watching her with an expression of wonder when he thought she wasn't looking. On a perfect May morning, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows, their son entered the world after a long but uncomplicated labor. The doctor and midwife from Dallas declared him healthy and strong, with a good set of lungs that he demonstrated promptly. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, cradling the swaddled infant with careful hands. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and your beautiful eyes. And your chin," Temperance observed, exhausted but radiant. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed various options during the waiting months, but had not settled on a final choice. "What about Thomas?" Ethan suggested, surprising her. "To honor the man whose love brought you west, where I was fortunate enough to find you." Tears welled in Temperance's eyes at the generous gesture. "Thomas Ethan Adler," she decided. "A name to be proud of. A name to live up to," Ethan agreed, sitting carefully beside her on the bed so they could admire their son together. Little Thomas thrived in the loving environment of the ranch. From his earliest days, he was the center of attention, adored by his parents and the extended family of ranch hands who appointed themselves his honorary uncles. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, as attentive and tender with his son as he was with Temperance. He would carry the baby in a sling across his chest while doing lighter chores around the ranch, talking to him constantly about the workings of cattle, horses, and the land. "He's too young to understand," Temperance pointed out with amusement. "Never too young to learn," Ethan countered. "Besides, he listens better than most of the hands." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the Adler household expanded again. Sarah Jenkins, who had become Temperance's closest friend, married Miguel in a ceremony performed in the same garden where the Adlers had exchanged their vows. The couple moved into the original cabin on the property, which Ethan had renovated as a wedding gift to his foreman. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and celebrations, work and rest. Temperance started a small school in one of the outbuildings, teaching the children of the ranch hands and neighboring properties. Her parents, gradually reconciled to her choice of life, finally visited when Thomas was 3, grudgingly admitting that she had built something meaningful in this place so different from Boston. The double prospered under Ethan and Temperance's stewardship. They added land when they could, improved their breeding stock, and established a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. The hardships that inevitably came, drought one year, illness another, were weathered together, their partnership strengthening with each challenge overcome. Their family grew again with the birth of a daughter, Emma Rose, when Thomas was 4, and another son, William, 2 years later. Each child brought new joy to the household, their distinct personalities enriching the family tapestry. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Ethan surprised Temperance with a special gift. While she had been visiting Sarah, he had transformed one of the unused downstairs rooms into a proper library, with built-in shelves lining the walls and a comfortable window seat overlooking the garden. "For the woman who loves books almost as much as she loves her family," he said, leading her into the room with his hands over her eyes. Temperance gasped when she saw what he had done. The shelves were already partially filled with volumes he had collected over the years, plus new acquisitions ordered specially from Dallas and even as far as St. Louis. "It's magnificent," she breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "When did you find the time?" "Been planning it for months," Ethan admitted. "Miguel and the men helped with the construction when you were occupied elsewhere. I had no idea." She ran her fingers along the polished wood of the shelves. "It's the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Ethan pulled her into his arms. "You gave me a family and a future, Temperance. A library seems a small thing in comparison." She reached up to touch his face, noting the lines that 10 years had etched around his eyes and mouth, lines of laughter and character that made him more handsome to her now than when they'd first met. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Taking a chance on a destitute widow with nothing but a dress and desperate hope, Ethan's answer was immediate and unequivocal. "Not for a single moment. Finding you was the greatest blessing of my life." "Even when I burned the biscuits that first week," she teased, recalling her early attempts at cooking for the ranch. "Even then," he assured her with a smile. "Though I'll admit I was relieved when your skills improved." They laughed together, the easy camaraderie of a decade's partnership evident in their interaction. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch swing Ethan had built the previous summer. The Texas night spread around them, star-filled and vast, much like the first night they had truly talked about their hopes and dreams. "I found my old dress today while organizing some trunks," Temperance mentioned, nestled against Ethan's side with his arm around her shoulders. "The one I was wearing when we met. It's hardly more than rags now." "I remember it clearly," Ethan said, blue calico torn at the hem, missing a button or two. I nearly threw it away. But you didn't, Temperance shook her head. It seemed important somehow to keep it. A reminder of where we started. Ethan nodded, understanding. From a dress and hope to all this, he mused, his gesture encompassing the ranch, their home, their life together. We've come a long way. And have a long way yet to go, Temperance added, thinking of their children growing up, the ranch expanding, the future stretching before them full of possibilities. Together, Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. Together, Temperance agreed, her heart full with the certainty that no matter what challenges or joys lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Above them, the star that had guided them home continued to shine, a constant in the ever-changing tapestry of their lives transformed by a chance meeting, an act of kindness, and the courage to hope for something more. As the years passed, the Adler Ranch became one of the most successful operations in North Texas. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's skill with horses and his mother's love of learning. Emma developed a talent for art, capturing the beauty of the Texas landscape in sketches and watercolors that eventually hung in galleries as far away as New York. Young William, the most adventurous of the three, learned to ride almost before he could walk and showed a natural instinct for cattle that even the most experienced hands respected. Temperance's school expanded as Dallas and the surrounding areas grew, eventually becoming a proper academy that served children from across the county. Her educational methods, combining traditional studies with practical skills and an appreciation for the natural world, gained recognition throughout the state. Ethan, though he claimed to be just a rancher, became a respected voice in territorial affairs, advocating for responsible land use and fair treatment of all settlers, regardless of background. His integrity and straightforward manner earned him the trust of neighbors and officials alike. They weathered the changes that came to Texas as it grew and developed, the expansion of railroads, the influx of new settlers, the gradual taming of what had once been wild frontier. Through it all, the Double-A remained a place of warmth and welcome, a haven in changing times. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their grown children, grandchildren, and friends who had become family, Ethan raised a toast to the woman who had transformed his life. "To Temperance," he said, his voice still strong though flecked with silver now touched his hair at the temples, "who arrived in Dallas with nothing but a dress and hope, and built a legacy of love that will outlast us all." Temperance, her beauty matured but undiminished by the years, met his eyes across the gathering. "And to Ethan," she responded, lifting her own glass, "who saw possibility where others might have seen only desperation, and who taught me that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding something far better." Their glasses touched amidst the applause and well wishes of those who had shared their journey, a simple gesture that symbolized the enduring partnership they had forged from the most unlikely beginning. Later, in the quiet of their room, Ethan held Temperance close, his heartbeat as familiar to her as her own after a quarter-century of sharing his bed and his life. "Happy?" he asked, a question he still posed occasionally, as though marveling at their good fortune. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Ethan's response was to kiss her with the same tenderness and passion that had characterized their love from the beginning. "More than I ever dreamed possible," he assured her. "And I intend to keep right on being happy with you for at least another 25 years. "At least," Temperance agreed with a smile. Outside their window, the Texas night spread vast and beautiful, stars scattered across the darkness like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Temperance and Ethan Adler rested in the certainty of a love that had begun with nothing but hope and address, and had proven more than enough to build a lifetime upon.